It's like, what if death isn't like this kind of sick, sad, morbid thing, like the process of dying, but it's rather this intense expulsion, kind of like energy exploding out of the sun, and it's like then you get trapped somewhere else. And so I was like, yeah, that's a little like that scared me a little bit, but.
Clifford Sargent runs a YouTube show called Better Than Food, where he reviews books in a very entertaining way. He says, "I'm just a guy who loves books and wants to help you find the ones that are going to change your life." In this episode, we talk to Clifford about the two subjects that come up the most often in literature: sex and, of course, death. We also get to chatting about DMT, orgasms, Nick Cave, Twin Peaks, and Georges Bataille. Clifford refers to himself as a death-obsessed pervert. He is very cool, and he looks like Christian Bale. Please do support the show by liking and sharing this episode on social media, and to make sure you don't miss out on any future episodes, sign up for our newsletter at deathhangout.com or clicking on the button on screen. Now get ready for this episode, which is called, of course, Death Obsessed Pervert.
You told me that your show was about sex and death. Maybe if you can expand on that, just to let us know why and how.
I'm interested in the intensity of experience at, like the limits, which is probably why I get into a lot of mid-century French authors, because they're really particularly concerned with the most intense moments of experience. And when I say sex and death, those are two enormously motivating forces for us as humans, like perhaps the major two, and somewhere in there, because I was reading a lot of a guy named Georges Bataille, who wrote a book called Story of the Eye, for those who are interested, and also wrote this phenomenal book on eroticism, about the connection between eroticism and death. His quote about eroticism was that it was assenting to life up until the point of death. And I thought that fundamental relationship was so fascinating and not reductive, but rather kind of like expansive, like just you could really like it brought up so many more questions, of course, than it answered. The intensity of being in our relationships and in our inner life is what I'm fascinated by. And so through eroticism and death, through sex and death, you access those spaces.
Yeah, I think the advertising industry has also picked up on that.
Sure, of course.
I mean, not death directly, but it's death of self, death of image of self, death of who you are. It's that being ostracized from society if you don't do this, if you don't conform to this standard, then it's that constant fear base of the death of something. Just when you say ascent to life, and just what does that mean for you when you say ascent to life?
Well, for him, I think it was life lived up until the limits, to where you're sort of losing yourself. It's like that breaking point, which I guess you could probably assume is like the orgasm. But like when at the heights, the little death, le petit mort, as they say in France. That moment where complete loss of self, where you exist, but you're not conscious of I. Like I suddenly is obliterated, and you're in this space that is existing, but it's not like present, and it's not dead, but you're lost. And we're just gonna like straight into it right here. We're just gonna like bypass like any sort of like I'm not English, so it's like
no bullshit. Come on, no small stories.
Yeah,
just go for
right.
it. Okay.
Like it's very similar to like doing DMT, which I have done. So it's like that space. You smoke the DMT, and then all of a sudden you're like, and you're just gone. And like that space is the closest to kind of like that void that you have when you have an orgasm, which I'm assuming not entirely assuming, but my theory is like that's probably as close to experiencing death as you can. Well, being a conscious human being. And of course, it's nice because it kind of ends a few minutes later. You smoke it and then it ends. And oh, that's very nice. You can access that and then come back. It is terrifying in a way. And I wanted to ask you guys this. I'm going to pose this question because it relates to it. Does the idea that consciousness continues after the death of your body terrify you?
Actually, yes, for me, yes.
Me too. Me too.
To me, there's something about the afterlife, Obviously, the primal fear is ceasing to exist. But what if you continue? And if you continue, what choice do you have? There's one of the scariest thoughts, which is this afterlife, which some of the near-death experience guys describe, which is this realm of angels and beauty and castles in the skies, and everything is so beautiful. And I'm saying to myself, if this is the afterlife, I don't want to be here. I don't want to be, because this is fucking boring. This is not what I want. This is not what I expect. But to me, this is just like your brain, I don't believe in an afterlife myself, because as a good French, I'm an atheist, and I believe this is just your brain kind of accessing unconscious memories, levels, and something like that.
I wouldn't say I have any particular fears about that, simply because I think whatever it is, whatever it is, I don't have the capacity to understand what it could be, because I can only understand things from the perspective I've ever had up to now. So just honestly, I don't feel any fear coming up. I think, as you said, Olivia, I think there's a lot of brain chemicals and stuff going on. It's why people have near-death experiences. But I also think it ties in to what Clifford was saying there, just that whole, it's almost that losing yourself moment. And again, just going from a religious point of view, and just from all the religions out there, all of them talk about this sort of transcendence and stuff, and there's like heaven on earth and all this kind of stuff. I think that there's a load of stories and stuff that's happened that have been passed on from people. They've had these experiences and they've tried to explain them again, but they can only explain them in the terms of the reality we live in. So it ends up sounding like this religious or outer worldly thing, whereas instead I think it's more something that we just haven't figured it out yet. And some people maybe, I think, do, sometimes by accident, other times by dedicated sort of pursuit, reach these levels. I mean, even without the use of ayahuasca or DMT. So I think there's something in that, in terms of death of self and the whole concept of ego. I think it's almost, I think there's a lot there. It's almost like we've got a load of stuff under the surface, but we just haven't broken through it yet. But I don't have any fear, because if we do continue, I don't see any reason why that would be any better or any worse than where we are. And if we don't, then there's nothing to fear, because because it's finished.
Cliff, what about you? Actually, you said about that, and you said you have also this fear, or is it something that bothers you, or is it something that kind of intrigues you?
So I'm watching Twin Peaks in bed the other night. Twin Peaks, David Lynch, and there's the new season, and there's this moment. I don't know if you guys have been watching this, but it's just absolutely absurd. My friend put it very succinctly. He said, this last episode that I just watched, it's number 8 in the new season, I think. He thought it was one of the greatest things in television, not only television, but there's this moment, and I'm not really ruining it because you have no idea what the fuck is going on. Pardon my French. But it's as if you're traveling through the inside of this atom bomb, when they were testing in America in the 50s, or the 40s, rather. And you're seeing all the clouds of energy and all of the explosions and stuff. And I was like, oh shit, what if that's what happens after you die? Like your life is placid and you're kind of just like, you're dying and you're on your deathbed and there's your family and there's your loved ones. And then all of a sudden you're shot back out again. Your consciousness, your body dies. And they're like, oh, there's your body. It's rotting. It's like, it's safe and sound underneath, but now you're like hurling through the maelstrom of the universe. And I was like, whoa, that's way more intense, like kind of, it's exciting and it's kind of cool because you want to do that, but it's also like terrifying because it's like, what if death isn't like this kind of sick, sad, morbid thing, like the process of dying, but it's rather this intense expulsion, kind of like energy exploding out of the sun. And it's like, then you get trapped somewhere else. And so I was like, yeah, that's a little like that scared me a little bit, but
it sounds terrifying. The way that you just describe it now, I think I would have nightmares.
that is. I mean, in a weird sort of way, it almost like it just popped into my mind there is it's like you almost described it as. It sounds like birth.
Yeah. Voila, and now you're somebody else.
You're so clever. You're so clever, Keith. Now.
It's just the way you described it. That's what it must be like.
What are your guys' earliest memories, if you want? Keith, you can go first. Since what is your earliest memory that you can conceive of?
My very earliest memory, just any kind of memory.
Yeah. Because I wonder how far it goes back for a lot of people, because I can't remember. Some people say they can remember their birth, but I have no conception of anything between. Yeah.
No, I think mine was. I know it was between the age of 1 and 3, but I couldn't tell you where. And I just remember sitting on a floor with black and white tiles, and just this big blow up sort of red plastic chair. That's it. That's my earliest memory. I remember sitting there and just fully aware of it and being there. And what's funny is my memory of it is that I'm the size I am now, even though I was this big. It's weird when you think about the fact that there's so much of our life is that it's already gone. It's already dead.
To continue on that, and Olivia, I want to hear your memories, but I thought of this right before we did this podcast. Isn't it interesting that we are sort of speaking? We've never really met in the flesh, and by the time these digital codes from living matter have been transcribed and sent across this thing, they're already sort of dead. Kind of a spooky subject, it's like almost like a lost or like a radio in the middle of space, talking about death through these dying signals, these already dead signals when they reach us, struck me as a little bizarre.
It's just like it's light from a dead star. That's all of our past. It's already gone.
And actually, it just reminds what you just said is about the books, by the way. When you read a writer who is already dead, and you can read the voice, and you can feel his aliveness, and especially when it's a kind of autobiographic, like Celine, for instance, and you can read that, and you just say, fuck, the guy is alive, that's the signals. But he's dead at the same time, and that's mine. And can you imagine us, this conversation, which is right now happening, we're alive, and maybe we'll be famous for sure. People will watch that again and say, look at this great wisdom, and they're all dead right now. What about you, this earliest memory of yours, when is that? So that's a good question, actually.
It was some light coming through an upstairs bedroom, sort of similar to an attic, and I have it. It's there. It's sort of like a painting, but it almost looks like a European style room with a lot of wood and not much furniture, but like morning winter light coming in through a window, illuminating the bed. And I think it was from when my mom was staying with her parents in Illinois, Chicago area, from way back when, I think. But I don't know if that's a real memory, and that's the most interesting thing to me.
Yeah.
I really have no way to verify that. But Olivia, what about yours?
I have a slight memory, I believe, H2 something, but actually the one that I remember vividly is actually a memory about death. It's a memory about me suddenly realizing my mortality and realizing that I will die. And I was just, holy shit, I was just like freaking out. And I was frozen. I could just couldn't picture what will happen next. And what I could see only is oblivion. After that was this sense of non-consciousness, black, non-existence, total annihilation. This is what I was saying. And I was just so scared about that. And because of this emotional shock, that obviously made me crazy that I am now, as you know, Keith, is I remember vividly this. The surroundings and everything. So, but let's go back to you actually and your passion of literatures and books and Georges Bataille, and I think this guy inspires you so much. So can you tell us a little bit more?
Georges Bataille had a point of view regarding death and exploring his inner complexities that resonated more with me on an emotional level than any other author I'd read. I'm not, probably because I'm an absolute, death obsessed pervert. I'm not sure, I couldn't tell you, but he was, I think he was born in around 1899. He was in the middle of the war. He had to abandon his father. He was about 15 years old. He was living in a small French town, and I think the Germans were bombing, and he had to abandon his blind and syphilitic father because he and his mother and his brother had to escape, and that was the last time he saw his father. When he returned to the small town, he returned to a coffin. And so death was very pervasive in his early formative years. He had a lot of strange neurotic obsessions which really came in use around the time of the Surrealists, because he was a young man at the time of the Surrealists and he was involved in those groups. But Bataille was so outrageous that André Breton, the head, the Surrealist leader, thought he was an obsessive, thought he was completely outrageous, and kind of kicked him out. So Bataille was kind of on the fringes of the Surrealists, and then found others who were kicked out of the Surrealists, and then they formed their own little group. And so it was kind of like the deviance of the weird movement. And he began writing fiction in the 20s, and he wrote a story called Story of the Eye in 1928, which is sort of a meditation on all of these obsessions that he had that had been growing since these intense experiences since childhood, manifested into one of the strangest, I think I'm going to call it a love story, but it's kind of like a love story told, this is going to sound pretentious, but kind of like on the scale of the universe, because what he creates is this visual cycle of objects wherein each object, which is asexual, that comes into contact with these very young lovers, gets incorporated into their games of total transgression, and therefore each object begins to represent this breaking away of like reality, kind of like this rip in the fabric of logical sense and consciousness. And they all look similar. They're sort of like eyes and eggs and the sun. And you see this cycle. It really is like this cycle of life and the process of life itself, from, these, like we were discussing earlier, with these violent births and these violent deaths, but illustrating the entire thing. And it's almost a children's story. I actually saw the first edition copy in Paris. It looks like a children's book with illustrations. Rather, they're like dirty illustrations for the time. It was like 1928. Nobody knew he was the author. He was a librarian by day and the author of Story of the Eye by night. The friends in his circle knew and his enemies knew, but nobody ratted him out. And nobody found out he was the author until 1962, after his death. Phenomenal. Great story. Wow. So this guy, this is before he started like a secret society and all this stuff, and then like also was like one of the guys who tried to rescue Nietzsche from the fascists and all that. So I mean, I could, 10 hours, absolutely, I could go on. I mean, in a short, he, I don't know, I don't know. His ideas were there are so many doors that he opened that nobody else has, that he is an endless source of fascination for me. And particularly because he goes to those places that nobody else wants to discuss, which is, eroticism and death.
There's a lot in there, as you've described. What's the overriding sort of theme, if you like, that's because it sounds like a powerful impact on you. So obviously, and it's around eroticism and death. But how's that played out in how you approach life now?
That's a pretty big question. Well, I mean, there were fundamental experiences that I felt akin to. I had two fathers who've died. So I had the first when I was 7 years old, and then my stepfather, who raised me, actually passed away 2 years ago when I was 26. Having an early experience with death, I'm always asking these questions, like and then of course finding as a teenager, kind of just like having this affinity for the darker stuff, probably because of it. You find that mixes with your erotic interests as well. how does it change? I don't know. I'm gonna be answering that question for the rest of my life. I'll send you the book, because it's difficult for me to analyze. Like, this is where like I found Georges Bataille and everything went wrong, and it probably did. I mean, like it may not be a good thing, Keith.
Yeah.
I'm gonna say that right now. It really may not. It's like it's my same thing with Yukio Mishima. Do you know Yukio Mishima? So Yukio Mishima was at one point in the 60s one of the Japan's most famous authors. This guy is something else. He wrote his very first novel, Confessions of a Mask, I think around 2021. It was huge. It was about being gay, a gay man in post-war Japan, which he was, even though he married. But at that time, you couldn't really be gay. You were just like, you don't say anything. So he wrote a slew of books after that, found success at a very young age, was frustrated with the lack of strength in the intellect compared to in the body. He began reading about the samurai code. He began reading about warriors. He was around the war. He was actually he was not accepted into the military for I think some sort of lung condition or something. So he felt weak, but he felt the poetry was also weak in a way. And so he got obsessed with bodybuilding, and he got obsessed with the code of the samurai, and he started really working out. And then all of a sudden you have this massively successful author who's like doing military drills for fun, who is just stacked like a fucking, Adonis. And this guy is one of the most intense dudes I have ever read. I mean, his writing is also phenomenal. He takes on this fascistic lifestyle, yet at the same time, he loves like Oscar Wilde and all of this very decadent art kind of stuff. Very interesting guy, like totally. But so in the end, at the age of 45, 1970, at this point, he has developed and trained a militia, a right-wing militia, to overthrow the government, basically, of Japan and go back to the ways of the emperor, because he feels like the West's influence has become, the Japanese have lost what they were all about. They have lost kind of like the spirit, the warrior spirit that they had before. So it's symbolic, but it's not. So he actually takes this militia. They call themselves the Shield Society. And they're all wearing their uniforms, and they all have these, these very imposing photographs, and they all have drills, like they're organized. And they go to the government base in Japan. And they stage this coup. And he walks out onto the podium of all these soldiers at their lunch break, and he starts addressing them and saying, disavow the influence of the West, come back to come with us. Let's be strong again. Let's be warriors. You've forgotten who you are. You've forgotten everything. Look at you guys. And they laugh at him. So he goes back inside the office of the commander, who he's tied up. He didn't kill anybody. He just tied him up. And he commits harakiri. He literally cuts his own stomach open and has his second in command chop off his head. And that is the end of Yukio Mishima. And that is kind of like taken on like this legendary, flavor now. It's almost like a myth, because it's like this guy was so in control of every single thing that he did that he basically wrote his own destiny with his suicide. And it really freaks people out. And I had a pretty visceral negative reaction the first time I read about that, because I was like, oh, he's crazy. It was like, who the fuck is this dude? Like, I was looking for all these things to rid myself of the idea that is actually kind of an amazing feat. But of course, now I've changed. I'm so impressed by that guy's dedication, even though it's absolutely on one level horrifying and on the other amazing. But and that's an interesting thing, to control your death, which is to say you've controlled your life. Kind of like, well, Hemingway was sort of like insane and really deteriorating by the end of it, but that was Mishima's thing. He didn't want to deteriorate. He had this massive emphasis on ending your life at the way you choose at the best moment of it. But very interesting to me. I'm not saying it's a good or bad thing, especially not for each person, but in his case, what a fascinating story that he literally ended as he chose. Unbelievable.
But there was a question that I had from there. You know, it's you describe the dedication that he has. What about your dedication? You know, because I assume all what you do right now about these books, you know, what's the mission? What's the goal with that? You know,
I had gotten the rights to make Story of the Eye, and then we had reached this major impasse as of late. And actually today I sent off the final email to Bataille's daughter saying that we're done, we're moving on, that this is not for now, this is just not going to work out. So there goes.
Oh.
6 years. What happened was I got a lot of people together, including, you know, I don't know if you guys have seen the movie In the Mood for Love by Wong Kar-wai. Yeah, beautiful film, one of my favorites. Like Chris Doyle, the guy, the cinematographer, who shot that. Giant fan of Story of the Eye. Went over to Hong Kong a couple of years ago, got him on board. Very nice guy. He stood by me this entire time. Found some producers in Los Angeles. That's why I lived in Los Angeles, because I wanted to get all this money to do this whole thing. And I came this close. I came very, 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 very close. And we had meeting with Amazon and like all these investors lined up, and the creative producers are getting on board. This is at the beginning of the year, maybe a couple months ago. And Chris is still there and everything's fucking going. I'm like, yeah, all right. And, you know, I'm not an experienced filmmaker. I had made a short film, which is a piece of shit, and I made some music videos, and that's it. And I'm trying to like pull the impossible project together like Werner Herzog is pulling the boat over the goddamn mountain. And I'm thrilled because each, you know, like it's enough to keep me going. And then we reach this impasse because his daughter has the ability to take away the name of the film and his name off if she doesn't like the finished project. And that doesn't have to be in the contract in France, we learned through our lawyer. Now, that's a big problem because no investor in their right mind would ever... Yeah, exactly. Fucking way. I wouldn't. I mean, no way. That's because it's somebody's whim. And they're like... You know, by the end of it, it's like, we don't like the film. Well, how much will it take to make you like the film? $3 million. That shit happens all the time. So it's been a learning experience. I could call it a failure. I have called it a failure. But that was the major goal. And now I've had to recalibrate, as you do throughout your life. Major life events happen. I don't regret anything. I've had many adventures because of that whole project, and it may in fact happen one day, but for now that dream has been laid to rest, and I have to find another.
The funny thing is, I discovered you actually not about the books, because you love the books, but you were also doing some movie critiques. There was only one, and this is how I discovered you. It's about the Nick Cave movie. Which is about, how is it called actually? One More Time with Feelings, something like that.
One More Time with Feeling, that's the one, yeah.
And you know, I love the album. The album is absolutely brilliant, but the story, the story behind is even, you know, it's basically he's losing his son in the middle of producing the album, you know, and the way that you just described this movie, you know, the way that you were so, you know, out there. I don't know where you were, but, you know, if I had to describe from the outside, you know, how a DMT experience was, you know, you were just like that. You were just like buzzing around describing the movie. And from there I said, well, this guy, there's something about him and death, you know, there's this relationship, there's a strong bond, because you were totally inside this. You were relating somehow to this movie. So I'm a bit curious about that. Maybe it's a voyeur kind of curiosity, but just, can you tell us a little bit more, if you can, about this relationship maybe?
Absolutely, and I you know, I'm not. I just want to preface this like I'm really not a victim in any sense that I can think of. I have had a phenomenal life. I have had my parents were incredibly supportive. You know, I really didn't want for much when I was growing up, and everything was mostly pretty rosy for me. That being said, a lot of men in my family have died, and so Nick Cave's son, and I've been a fan of Nick Cave for quite a while. I think personally that he's one of my favorite musicians. I thought The Birthday Party was quite possibly the most incredible thing to come out of the early 80s, his first band when they were in Berlin. I still think that band is absolutely phenomenal and changed the whole face of everything and does not get much credit at all. But his son, Nick Cave's son, passed away about a week, maybe 10 days or a week after my dad did, my stepfather. And I was there in the hospital watching my stepfather pass away after 2 years of almost 2 years of staying and taking care of him with my younger brother. I was actually there literally looking into my dad's eyes as he left whatever this is. Have either of you seen somebody die?
Actually, the actual moment of death.
The actual moment of death?
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's, man. Yeah, it's a... So he had lung cancer, and so this is the very end, and he's looking at me, and I'm looking at him. I don't think he sees me, but he sees, his eyes are open. He was kind of in a coma, sort of. And this is on the 4th of July. So there's like bombs, fireworks going off in the distance. You hear these echoes, these explosions, very, very strange. And I'm wearing all white, and a white dress shirt and white jeans. It's very strange. And my brother's there, and my dad's friend, this very, very old wife of his friend. So the three of us were sitting there. And all of a sudden, as he's really dying, I'd gotten a phone call that it was probably going to happen. And now, sure enough, it is. And his eyes shoot open. And he's looking directly at me. I move into his line of sight, and he's just staring so far past. It's like a 1,000-yard stare, but he's staring somewhere past me. And it immediately made his face look kind of younger, like much, much younger. Like it's like the most, like almost like this pure expression, like he's seeing some, like, who even knows? It's one of the most intense, maybe the most intense thing I've ever seen in my entire life. And then, he passes away. And so after having that experience, I go down to Los Angeles, and I wake up one day, and my friend tells me that Nick Cave's son has fallen off the cliff, and he's just reading it on his phone. And I'm just saying, it's sad when an old man dies. It's not quite a tragedy because it's going to happen to all of us. When your son dies. Now that is something. So my grandfather, I had my original dad, my biological dad, had passed away, and then my uncle had passed away, and then my grandmother passed away. So my grandfather had 2 sons and a dead wife, and I saw what that did to a person, and I can't even. I mean, it's like one of the worst things you could possibly go through, I think, is losing your kid. But I'm sure, he's like then being famous and having the onslaught of attention from that, and then having your life defined by that tragedy as well must be, and that's not even something I actually went into, but just the difficulty of like dealing with that. It's like, yes, I know, like, my son is dead, and I'm grieving, and now I'm going to be defined by this whole tragedy for like the rest of my life, and I'm going to have to be constantly reminded of it. Oh, so exhausting, my God. So I just had a lot of sympathy for him because I love his music, and I think he's a phenomenal guy, and he's a nice guy. My producer he's also a giant fan of Story of the Eye. You see how all this comes full circle. My producer actually talked with him, and he said, we wanted him to be in the movie, and he was very, very polite, but he said his filmmaking days, they're over. Thank you very much. Really, that was actually after all the tragedy. So he was a very courteous guy. I can only say nice things about Nick Cave, but yeah.
Well, I love the mug, actually. Have a great life. You just that's actually
this is a great thing. The Museum of Death in Los Angeles. I love this mug. My girlfriend or my wife got me this mug. The Museum of Death. Have you guys heard of this place?
No, actually,
I hadn't.
No.
Okay, I'm sure there's lots of museums of death.
Yeah.
But this is a specifically fucking weird place. This is the serial killer museum, and this just goes into the fascination with death that we all have. But Americans, they take it to a whole new I mean, you have the shoes of John Wayne Gacy in there, the clown shoes that are hand painted. You have like the sketches from Richard Ramirez of like Satan, like going, and there was a quilt that was sewn by the Manson family. And there was, just all kinds of stuff. A good friend of mine, too, he's a cinematographer. He does some fairly, he's much more successful than I. I mean, he's an Irish fellow named Dan. And he shot the adaptation of the book My Friend Jeffrey Dahmer, which was a graphic novel, and it recently got adapted into a film, and so that's going to come out. And so he went and shot at Jeffrey Dahmer's original childhood house where he committed his first murder. He was just like telling me like, man, no, dude, like that place, it's creepy, dude. So
yeah. Well,
again, please support the show by signing up at depthhangout.com or clicking on the subscribe button on your screen.